In this game, we get to see how the great Tigran Petrosian was able to win a game of chess with little to no tactics at all or combinational play. He was able to set up a structure that his opponent simply crumpled underneath. And his opponent is no slouch. It's the great Svetozar Gligoric. This game was played at 1953 Zurich, one of the most famous tournaments in chess history. Two famous chess books were written about this tournament. If you want to become familiar with chess history, this tournament is a must know. You really have to know about this tournament. So let's jump into the game. Petrosian has white, Gligoric has black. Petrosian begins with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and Gligoric plays bishop to g7, the King's Indian defense. Really a risky opening against Petrosian. He once said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he fed his family on the King's Indian because he was so good at beating the King's Indian defense. e4, d6, and here Petrosian plays f3. Both of these players, Petrosian and Gligoric, have mainline variations of the King's Indian named after them, but they don't play either one here. He plays the Zamish variation, and the strength of this line is that he is really solidifying that e4 point, making it very strong, very hard for black to put pressure on. The downside is it does make it harder to develop the kingside minor pieces, this knight and bishop, because the knight's natural square is taken away from it. The knight wants to go to e2, but it's hard to do that without blocking in the bishop at f1, and so forth. So you get a little bit, but you have to give up something. Castles, bishop to e3, and the main line these days is probably c5, either transferring into a Benoni structure after d5 or playing what's known as the Zamish gambit, where black gives up a pawn, but black is more than fine here. This is a good line for black. You can also play the pano, attacking the d4 square with pieces, but Gligoric plays what was the main line, certainly at the time, and that's e5, a standard structure, trying to create that Mar del Plata structure where each side is competing for pawn breaks on opposite sides of the board. And d5, Petrosian immediately grabs space, just like in his variation of the King's Indian in the main line. You play d5 immediately, just grab the space that is offered to you. Knight to h5 is played by Gligoric. Basically, his idea is to unblock the f-pawn so he can play it to f5 and gain counterplay along the f-file or space on the king side. It also allows his queen to go to h4 and deliver check if that's something he wants to do. Queen to d2 is played by Petrosian. And notice he is controlling this h6 square, although he doesn't want to trade off dark squared bishops here the way you would in other lines, because this dark squared bishop is actually quite bad, blocked in by these central pawns. But he's also clearing the way for his king to castle on the queen's side. And that can be a very effective plan in the King's Indian because so much of black's play is geared towards a kingside attack. Putting your king on the queen side sometimes makes it harder for black. f5 is played by Gligoric. Castle's long. And here he makes the decision to play f4 and grab space. That might have been a strategic error. Keeping that pawn here and maybe opening the f-file at some point. The knight could maybe jump into f4 at another point. The problem with f4 is this: after bishop to f2, he's playing for this main pawn break at g4. The problem is the king is on the queen side now, not on the king side. He can still create weaknesses on the king side, but there's no king there to attack. So that makes it a little bit less effective than it usually would be. Petrosian, of course, is setting up the traditional queenside break of c4, c5. Bishop to f6. This bishop is obviously very bad. These pawns completely block it. So it's aiming at the h4 square. He would love to trade off the dark squared bishops, his bad one for white's good one. Knight g to e2, bishop h4, offering that trade. But Petrosian says, no, thank you. I don't want to make that trade. I want you to keep that bad piece. g5, continuing forward to play the g4 pawn break. And Petrosian plays the white's main pawn break, c5. The idea is to take on d6, create a weakness on the d6 square, and then maybe play along the c-file. But there are some other options, and we see those in this game. g4 is played by black. King to b1, getting the king off of the c-file so that the rook can move over. And gf3, taking and creating a weakness on the f3 point. He could have also just played rook to f7 with the idea of playing rook to g7 before he made that break. But gf3, and now there is a weakness on f3, but there's a question as to how valuable that weakness is. Knight to a6, aiming at the c5 pawn and the c5 square. A lot of times black will put a knight on c5. But what Petrosian does here is quite interesting. We know he loves space. Well, he plays c6, grabbing even more space, not going out, continuing with the idea of creating a weakness on d6, but instead grabbing more space on the queen's side. If you play b6 here, then a3 makes it very hard to do anything with this knight. If the knight goes to c5, then just b4. The knight really has nowhere to go. And it's sort of, if it's on b8, it can't go to c6, it can't go to d7. So the knight is in very bad shape after b6. Queen to e8 is the computer's recommendation, but already white has a clear advantage here. He plays the move knight to f6. Now this turns out to be a blunder. By modern computers show it's a blunder, but it takes a modern computer to see why. The basic problem with this move is that it is removing protection from the f4 pawn. Pawn takes b7, bishop takes b7, and here Petrosian had a powerful move he could have played that modern computers show us, and that's this move knight takes f4. And that's why moving the knight from h5 back to f6 was a mistake. The reason this is so powerful is after pawn takes knight, you don't recapture the pawn at f4, you play bishop to d4. And that's basically it. White's just totally winning here. The threat of queen to f4, which by the way would trap the bishop at h4, combined with the rook coming to g1 and the bishop controlling this diagonal, means that basically white's position is already decisive. What Petrosian does instead is he plays the move knight to g3, offering up the knight and also threatening to hop in to the f4 square. If black takes the knight, then after pawn takes, he would be forced to take with the bishop and then queen to g5 check with a double attack on the king and the bishop. After king h8, queen g3, we can see that white has a pretty easy position with tons of play against black's king. So what Gligoric does instead is he plays the bishop back to c8 to control the f5 square and allow his king maybe slip over to h8. Knight g to e2, and now the knight goes to c5. Here Petrosian makes a decision that not every player would make. He gives up his very nice dark squared bishop for the knight at c5. He does this to create pawn weaknesses. And when we talk about him winning without a lot of tactics, this is what we're talking about. Gaining space, creating pawn weaknesses, and just attacking the targets he's created. After pawn takes, I count 5 pawn weaknesses. The a7 pawn, the c7 and c5, e5, and h7 pawns are all weak and can be targeted. All really not something you want against anybody, particularly against Tigran Petrosian. So he plays the knight to c1, threatening to attack these weaknesses at c5 and e5. Queen to e7 defends those, but now knight to b3, attacking c5 and also threatening knight to a4, adding another attacker to the c5 pawn. Bishop to d7 keeps that knight out of a4, but watch this really nice maneuver that Petrosian utilizes to attack the weaknesses. First, he plays queen to g2 check. So Gligoric has to respond to that check, which he does, and now queen g1, adding another attacker on the c5 pawn, a really nice little maneuver to put pressure on that pawn. The knight goes to e8. He knows he can't save the pawn, but he wants to put the knight on d6, which is the best square for the knight. It's a nice blockading square. Queen takes c5, knight to d6. And here, Petrosian could already just grab the c7 pawn, but he thinks, I think, it's a weakness. It's not going anywhere. I don't have to take it just yet. So he plays the rook to c1, just piling up on that c-file. The bishop moves to e8, allowing the queen to defend c7, and also the bishop can move to h5 to attack the weakness at f3. The bishop goes to h3, and what this does, in addition to just being a nice diagonal for the bishop, it keeps a rook from going to c8 and defending the pawn at c7. a5, Gligoric is trying to open up lines against this white king. This is actually a pawn sacrifice, and Petrosian does take it. Now here is a nice idea from Gligoric. Bishop to f2. Looks like he's just hanging the bishop to the queen, but after Petrosian captures it, which he does in the game, Gligoric is able to take the knight at a5. And he basically is trying to create play along the A and B files, attacking the white king. Rook h to g1, grabbing the open file. Bishop to g6. The e4 pawn is in the way of the bishop, but it's also aiming at the king, and perhaps a well-timed sacrifice at some point could open up lines for black. Bishop to f1. Petrosian wants to move the bishop to d3 to neutralize that g6 bishop. Petrosian was known for what's called prophylaxis, essentially anticipating your opponent's attacks and stopping them before they even start. And that's what this idea is. Bishop f1, bishop d3, and just neutralize that bishop on g6. Rook to b8, attacking b2. Rook to c2, defends b2. Knight to f7. It clears the way for the queen to enter into the attack. Also adds a little more defense to the e5 pawn. Petrosian's not worried about that. He just plays h4, gaining space on the king's side. Knight to d6, bishop to d3, that neutralizing move we talked about, defending e4. Rook to b4, threatening to come into d4 and attack that bishop at d3. Now here a strong idea would have been h5, because after bishop takes h5, queen to h2, which hits the bishop. If bishop takes f3, then queen to h3 is really, really powerful. The bishop has nowhere to go, and if it takes on e4, then knight takes, and queen to c8 check, and he just gets mated in a couple of moves. And that's actually checkmate because the rook covers the g file. So rook g to c1, though, was played instead. Rook to d4, attacking the bishop at d3. The bishop retreats to f1. Queen to d8, trying to activate the queen along the b file while leaving the knight on its nice d6 square. The knight to e2 attacks the rook at d4. That rook moves to a4, attacks a2. The knight goes back to c3. The rook returns. And of course, Gligoric would be happy with the draw here. Petrosian would not be. So he plays b3, controlling the c4 and the a4 squares, making it hard. The rook can't go back to a4 after knight to e2. Queen to b8, though, pins that pawn, aims down the b file. h5 attacks the bishop, g6, and after bishop takes h5, now queen to h4, attacking the bishop and threatening check on f6. And in this position, Gligoric resigned. A game almost played completely strategically, on strategic terms, with very few tactics or combinations. Now, why does he resign here? If the bishop takes on f3, then queen f6 check, king g8, bishop to h3. And the threat of bishop e6 combined with rook to g1 is just curtains for black. And if he retreats back to g6, then queen f6, king g8, and the same idea of bishop to h3, bishop to e6 would be decisive. A brilliant game from one of the greatest players in chess history. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.